and welcome to the Red Team Draft Podcast. I'm your host, Alex West, and I'm joined today by the entire team plus one, starting with our executive producer, Mr. Eustacchio Raulli. Follow him on Twitter at EVR1022. Eustacchio, what's up, man?
Not too much. Doing good.
Good. Our prodigy himself, Mr. Connor Harr. Connor, how are you?
I'm good. I was thinking of something witty to say in my intro, but there wasn't a lot of basketball stuff going on. But
You nailed it.
But I did lock my keys in my car today and lost an hour of prep time.
Okay, all right. So this is all good. You can follow Connor on Twitter at HarConnor. Also, Mr. Josh Earl. Josh, how are you today, sir?
I'm doing all right. How are you, my friend?
I'm doing great, Josh. You can follow Josh on Twitter at 2RedJEarl. And then last but not least, our guest, Mr. Trevor Magnotti. You may know him from the Step Back. He also writes for Fear the Sword, and you can follow him on Twitter at Illegal Screens.
I'm good. Thanks for having me on.
We are pumped to have you. You're our first official guest, so that's always going to be something you can put on your resume. You can list that you were the first guest on the Red Team Draft Podcast. So we're going to start talking today. We promised last week that we were going to talk about Darius Garland. Garland injured his meniscus, was a prominent player, a player that sort of oscillated between early lottery, late lottery, somewhere in the first, a player who seemed to have a big impact, but he was injured. He's going to miss the entire season. We have a very small sample size from which to draw. So we're going to start first talking about what his injury means. Trevor, tell us a little bit about this injury, tearing a meniscus, what it means in terms of how long it takes to recover, what impact it may have on his athleticism, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, so the meniscus is kind of the shock absorber in the knee. It's mainly responsible for helping our knee to be able to cushion against the forces it goes through when we do athletic activities like running, jumping, and cutting. It basically helps keep the femur, which is the thigh bone on top of the tibia, our lower leg bone, to make up the knee joint. So what Garland did is he tore a piece of that shock absorber. And when you get a tear, the little piece of the tear can end up getting stuck or caught in the joint. And it ends up causing pain, irritation, in some cases can actually physically block the joint from flexing and extending, which obviously is a big problem. So his injury is one that is pretty much always going to need surgery to fix because the meniscus is made out of cartilage. Cartilage doesn't heal very well by itself. So he is elected to have a meniscus repair. There's two different ways that you can treat a meniscus injury. The first one is you can trim out the torn piece and basically just smooth it down, basically just taking out the tear, smoothing out what's left and making it into the shape of what the meniscus was before, but with a little bit less of that shock absorber. With a repair, they actually go in and take a stitch and try to tie that piece of meniscus that's torn back down to the rest of the meniscus shape. Preserves the meniscus completely, but the downside is it takes a little bit longer to heal. That's why Garland is going to miss probably the rest of the season. Usually a meniscus repair takes about 3 months to recover from. Meniscectomy, which is the removal of that piece of meniscus, usually takes about 6-8 weeks. So when you see guys who have gone through a meniscus injury, go have surgery, get like have like a 6 to 8 week timetable, that's usually because they've had that removal of that torn piece. Longer recovery is going to be that repair. That's going to be more like what Eric Bledsoe had when he tore his meniscus when he was with the Suns. There are some benefits and negatives to that. One of the big benefits of the meniscus repair is that it promotes that long-term knee health. You're at less of a risk of having that knee wear down earlier because with the removal, you have less of that meniscus as a shock absorber. Less shock absorber is going to put more force on the joint, is going to make it wear down faster. With a meniscus repair, you get to save that little bit. The downside of it is there's the risk that it could re-tear, that stitch could give out, and the meniscus could not fully heal. You could end up with another re-tear, and that ends up having another surgery. And the other problem is that it takes a lot longer to recover from. So Garland's elected to have the repair, which is usually the safer option, is definitely the more prudent option with him. He knows that he has an NBA future ahead of him. He wants to make sure that he is 100% ready for the draft, and I think that's why he probably elected for that season-ending surgery rather than trying to make a comeback with the meniscectomy.
How long? No, let me rephrase. What kind of impact does this have long term in terms of his explosiveness, his second jump ability? I mean, like, what are we looking at long term? If this repair takes, can we expect to see a fully 100% Darius Garland in a year? Is this a 2-year injury to get back to 100%, or does he, maybe never make it back to where he is now?
Well, I think we can draw off of some other players who have experienced similar issues. Russell Westbrook is a good example, and so is Eric Bledsoe. Both of those guys got back to their pre-injury level of explosiveness, or at least pretty close to it. We've seen Westbrook come back and win MVP after having this meniscus repair. We've seen Bledsoe be very productive for the Bucks this season after having that injury. It does take a little bit of time to recover from, mostly because you have to regain that trust in your ability that when you land from that jump that you can actually absorb that force from that impact. And that's one of the biggest things to get down, as it is with pretty much any knee surgery. But this doesn't have the real impacts on athleticism that we see from people who have ACL tears or people who have big medial collateral ligament injuries to the stabilizers on the sides of the knees. Really, the only time when a meniscus injury really negatively impacts you is when you've already had other stuff going on. Think, for example, Brandon Roy, who had meniscus issues after he had the osteochondral defects with his cartilage in his knee. Another good example there is Derrick Rose, who tore his meniscus a couple times after his ACL surgery. A lot of that came from when he had that ACL surgery. Things didn't really fully heal there, and he didn't have the same stability that he would have had with the natural ACL. So those are the main reasons that we see people struggle. In Garland's case, I don't really see that being an issue unless he starts to have other issues outside of his meniscus.
All right, Josh, we touched a little bit on this. We talked about Brandon Roy, which I'm just going to go ahead and up front apologize that we had to talk about Brandon Roy when it came to injuries. But walk us through some other guys who've had this injury, maybe a little bit who have been affected a little bit more, maybe those that haven't been quite as affected. What have you found in your research?
Well, research was a little tough this week, had a lot going on, but I did find that there was a study that covered 21 seasons worth of NBA injuries. I think it came out in 2013. So it's not covering the more recent meniscal tears. But there was 129 meniscus tears that occurred alone, so not in conjunction with some other knee injury at the time, over those 21 seasons in the NBA. And basically 4 out of the 5 players on average who've had meniscal injuries on the NBA level have been able to still play in the NBA going forward. And most of them have generally gotten back to the same level that they were at beforehand. Like Trevor mentioned with Russell Westbrook, Eric Bledsoe, those guys really kind of got back to at least a very close approximation of what they were beforehand. There's about 1 in 5 players on average who wound up never playing an NBA game again afterwards. But some of that might be somewhat tied to lesser players tearing their meniscus, guys that are kind of on the end of the rotations or, 10-day contract type guys. So in general, the research backs up pretty much everything Trevor said and would suggest that it's not going to be a major significant issue for Garland's future in the NBA unless, it comes accompanied with some other form of injury in that area.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, Garland, not particularly large, not a big fella. He's 6'2", 175 pounds, not carrying a lot of extra weight. there's really not any reason when you look at this to believe that he won't be able to round back into form or do the things that he has done. Now, let's explore as a group, and I want to get Eustacchio and Connor involved here. I want to talk about Darius Garland, the player, because what we have is a 5-game sample size wherein he scored 16.2 points, 3.8 rebounds, showed some nice ability from what I've seen to be a rebounder for his size, but only 2.6 assists, a guy who kind of handling the ball a good bit of his time. I mean, and not really spreading it around, not really able to create for others, has a knack for scoring. What have you seen in Darius Garland in this tiny sample size that makes you believe one way or the other about his draftability? Connor, I'm going to start with you on this one. What have you seen as you've watched Darius Garland that was encouraging, and then what's discouraging?
Well, I've really enjoyed Darius Garland's film as I had the opportunity to go through it this week and prep for the podcast today. I think that he's really does have elite quickness with the ball in his hands. I think that's what really stands out the most immediately to you. He has a very tight handle as well. He changes directions very quickly, bursts out of them well. One of the things that I thought too was for a player that young with the speed that he has, he's for the most part a pretty decent decision maker and really doesn't ever look like he's extremely sped up with being so fast. I think that one of the things to really like about him is his pull-up jump shot, which generates a lot of his points, but he can also get in the lane and has a really good floater. Flash the ability to shoot off movement a little bit on baseline out of bounds plays, and other than that, I think that his assist numbers really don't do him a lot of justice. I think Vanderbilt's team context really hinders him a little bit with the lack of secondary scoring they have on their roster outside of Shitu, and a lack of perimeter shooting outside of Ryan. So I think that Darius Garland made a very, very strong impression, even though the competition wasn't ideal and the sample size wasn't ideal, especially on the offensive end of the floor.
Eustacchio, let's talk a little bit about some of the things that Connor touched on there, particularly Garland operating with the ball in his hands, something he did quite a lot. How did you feel like his handle was? How do you feel like it's going to translate? I mean, obviously it's a small sample size, but we did get a pretty decent amount of seeing him handle the ball. And how do you think that carries over to the next level?
I think he's an NBA level ball handler right now. He has a full array of dribble moves, and what he does particularly well, I think, is he shows a really great ability to change speeds, great hesitation moves, and he has the patience to wait for his defender to get off balance before he uses his burst to get into the lane or to set up a jump shot. And so I think his ball handling is going to unlock a lot of the other areas of his game that perhaps aren't necessarily as special on their own, but they will have plenty of opportunity to shine because his ball handling will put him in a position to take those pull-up shots or to create passing angles for his teammates. And Connor touched on this a little bit with his passing, but I think the numbers are worse than the reality of his passing a little bit. His assist to turnover ratio was pretty bad, but a lot of the turnovers were the type of aggressive mistakes that you want a young point guard to be making to try to puncture the defense and create plays that are difficult. And sometimes the execution isn't there, but it's the right type of mistake. And I counted several potential assists that ended simply in missed shots by his teammates in the 2 games that I was able to watch of his. His assist total could easily have been about 50% higher than it was. And so I don't think he's going to be the most dynamic playmaker for his teammates, but I don't think it's quite as bad as it looks on the surface level for his numbers. So I think there's a lot to like here as a potential primary ball handler in the future.
Yeah, and so much of point guards is predicated from how they can handle the ball, how they can attack the defense. But on the other side of that, you rely a lot on being able to shoot, being able to shoot off the dribble, being able to hit those pull-up jumpers, because space is at a premium in the NBA always. And Trevor, you wrote for the Step Back this week. You talked about pull-up shooting Garland. You were comparing Garland to Kobe White from Carolina and kind of comparing the two. What did you see as you went through the film and you looked at Garland? And I mean, even as he compares to sort of a guy like White, what did you see that was encouraging for his ability to translate to the next level, even in just the few games that he played?
Well, I think the biggest thing was what Eustacchio talked about a little bit ago, where he does such a good job of using his handle to get into his pull-up jumper. He is very reliant on his ability to create space with crossover moves, to be able to use those in and out dribbles, to be able to get his defender going backwards and then be able to step back and get into a jumper quickly. He transitions very well from that dribble move into that shot, and honestly is on the level, I would say, probably of the two elite pull-up shooters from last year's class, Trae Young and Luka Doncic, in that regard, and just his ability to create space with his dribble and then be able to translate that into that jumper with pretty good efficiency. The one thing that I think also I like about him is he has a lot of those little junk shots that you like to see from guys who don't have the elite athleticism, where Kobe White is so predicated on his ability to start and stop on a dime and be able to accelerate into the teeth of a defense and then just instantly pull up in the way that like a Damian Lillard does. With Garland, you see much more of that step back. You see much more of the pump fake and then the little scoop shots in the paint. And I think that's really going to help him address that size concern. Not only does he have the ability to get to that pull-up with that or against a defender and comfortably hit that against somebody who's contesting him, he also knows those little ways to be able to get the defender off balance and then be able to throw up a little scoop shot or hook shot coming around the defender to be able to potentially draw a foul, or at least be able to get a clean shot off when he gets smothered on a drive. So I like that part of his game as well. That's one of the things that I think he's strongest at. I still kind of like White as a long-term prospect, just because I think that size problem is going to be an issue for him in the NBA. We're seeing that a little bit with Trae Young. That pull-up three-pointer just isn't as often there for him when it's a 6'7" shooting guard switching on to him as opposed to, a 6'4" college player. And I think that Garland's going to suffer from the same issue, whereas White probably isn't, because he's got that explosiveness and he's got that height. But all those little craft things that are going to help him be able to compensate for that, he's got at a pretty high level already.
Josh, what about the mechanics themselves? This is something you've taken an interest in, and you've written a really nice outline. What do you see in Garland's mechanics?
Well, I think it's great that he's got the handle to generate space for himself, and that he's able to quickly transition into his jumper as well as he is off the dribble, because mechanically speaking, there are a couple of things that are going to be problematic on the NBA level. I'm not too concerned about them long term. I think they're fairly fixable. First things first, I think he's got very good footwork in terms of getting his feet, his hips, and his shoulders squared to the basket off of not just a move. He also tends to string a series of moves together that has your momentum going all sorts of different ways, and he's able to still get his feet where they need to be to really give him good balance on his shot. That said, he's a forehead shooter, so the elbow angle ideally is supposed to be about 90 degrees. If it's more acute, what happens is it causes more of a flatter arc, which can also make the shot more easily contestable or blocked, which not as big an issue on the NCAA level as it is on the NBA level, where you have taller, longer, quicker, smarter defenders who are more likely to actually be able to contest a higher opportunity rate of those shot attempts. So that's going to be an issue he's going to have to fix, but it shouldn't be a tough one. When he is shooting off of movement, whether that's coming off of a series of moves off the dribble or coming off of some off-ball screens. He does have a tendency to kind of drift a little. He doesn't often go straight up and down. So that could suggest he might have some need for further refinement in his core strength. That would be something that wouldn't be too hard to fix. That should help with that. And then the one thing that is more of a pet peeve for me than necessarily anything super bad is he flexes his wrist instead of flicking it. So it's not really a soft shot release. It's kind of more of like a jerky type shot release in terms of the power generated. And so it has a little less softness. And that can sometimes lead to less kind bounces or rolls on the rim. You know, when people say shooters have touch, that wrist flexion instead of flicking is going to impinge on some of his touch. So that would be another thing that he needs to fix. But in general, given his handle, the ability to transition into his shot very easily, and the fact that I think most of these are pretty fixable, he projects to be a pretty solid shooter on the NBA level.
Let's talk a little bit more about his off-ball offense, and then we'll flip over and talk about his defense and his tools. I kind of want to hit on everything since we have the completed picture of what Darius Garland is. Eustacchio and Josh, kind of talk us through what his off-ball ability is. I mean, this is a player who played with the ball in his hands a lot. So there's not a huge sample size. There's not a huge amount of tape to look at these things. But, guys, what did you see in particular? Eustacchio, I'll start with you, and then Josh, just jump in right thereafter and just walk us through what you saw in this film.
So like you said, there's not a big sample of him working off the ball, but I thought there were a few very promising signs. In the very first game he played, he had two perfectly executed baseline out of bounds plays. He was the inbounder, and he inbounded and sprinted to the corner on the first one, caught the ball, and immediately drained a three. Really good job getting his balance, and it sort of showed promise of what he could do if he played next to another high-level creator, if you could script some of these actions off the ball instead of doing it on a baseline out of bounds. And then on the second one, he threw a no-look pass on the inbound, sprinted to the wing, caught it, pumped his defender into the air, then took a slide step to the left and drained a three. So those two out-of-bounds plays sort of showed his promise of what he could do as an off-ball threat. There aren't a lot of I think there were only 4 off-ball or off-screen plays logged in Synergy, and 2 of them I wouldn't even consider really off-screen plays when you watch them. So there's not a lot to go on here. But I think the building blocks are there, the ability to transition quickly into a shot, and like the footwork that Josh talked about earlier, being able to square to the basket. There's a lot that could play into him becoming a good off-ball player, but it's theoretical at this point.
Yeah, I completely agree right there. Those 2 baseline out-of-bounds plays were really nice. And definitely a nice little appetizer, if you will. I would love to see more. Obviously, can't this season. And like Eustacchio said, there wasn't a whole lot beyond those, really, that showed too much of him off ball. You know, if he makes some improvements in his shot mechanics, I think he'll be a very solid catch and shoot threat, too. So if he were to be paired with a primary ball handler on the wing or also in the backcourt, then he might, be well served in that if he makes those little tweaks to his form. Like Eustacchio said, though, I think the off ball, like off movement type stuff is still kind of more theoretical and is more teased by those 2 baseline out of bounds possessions than anything that we can feel fairly confident about. But I do look forward to seeing more of that from him on the NBA level.
Just super unfortunate. I mean, obviously injuries are haunting no matter what. You hate to see a talented guy go down in any regard, but for a player who obviously had some questions about what he could do physically, to not be able to play the entire season, to only get 5 games in, and to have several of those games come against subpar competition with Alcorn State, Liberty, Kent State, and Winthrop all on the schedule. We just don't have a lot to go on in Darius Garland, and that's kind of a bummer because how much we've expected from him and what we saw coming in. And Connor, let's flip over and talk about him on the defensive side of the floor. You and Eustacchio kind of focused on his defense, and what did you see on against this low-level competition? Obviously, you have to couch some of that in that. What did you see about his defense that was impressive to you?
One of the things that really stuck out to me with Garland was he wanted to be very aggressive on the defensive end of the floor, at least when the game started before Vanderbilt got a sizable lead on their lesser level competition. He really smelled a weakness in the opposing team's guards and wanted to translate their guards' mistakes into easy offense by really wanting to be a strong point of attack defender. And I think that's what you really want him to be as a smaller guard. He's not really going to be a guy that's going to be able to give guys a step or two, even though he doesn't really need to. You don't want him to be a guy that's going to get blown by a lot because he's not going to have the length or any kind of strength to sort of challenge a shot at the rim at any point.
Yeah, I thought Garland's defense, he was pretty solid at the point of attack. He has the quickness to keep up with players and stay in front of them. Not always the best technique, but I was really watching him a lot off the ball to see if he could make an impact there, because that's sometimes where players with a smaller frame that can't necessarily make the high impact plays can help just by making crisp rotations and being in the right place at the right time. And because Garland has pretty good court awareness on the offensive end, I was hoping to see some of that on the defensive end, being in the right place to cut off plays. But honestly, I didn't see that same type of court awareness on defense. The 2 games I watched, against Winthrop, he didn't really respect the guys he was guarding and he cheated off of them, but his help rotations were mostly half-hearted. He didn't commit to them fully and then just was caught in no man's land a lot. And because he's playing alongside another 6'2" guy, he was guarding a lot of shooting guards. So he's not always at the point of attack like he would be in the NBA much more often. And the game against USC, he was guarding a pretty good shooter on the opposing team, and he stuck to him pretty close throughout the game, was attentive to when he tried to move off the ball, but he didn't really make any efforts to in help defense during that game, and he did get lost at times here and there. So overall, his defense was a mixed bag for me. When he's going to be forced to be on the ball more in the NBA up against bigger players, and I'm concerned about him on that end. I don't think it's necessarily a fatal flaw, but it's something that is probably going to be a weakness for him moving forward.
I think you brought up a really interesting point there, sort of talking about how much of it is want to, how much of it is doesn't know how. And we were in the layout for the episode, we were going to talk about tools next, but I think it just lends itself to talk about sort of his basketball IQ. And Eustacchio, I'm going to bounce this back to you and then over to Trevor, but what do you think about his basketball IQ? How much of it is him not wanting to guard or him not necessarily giving the highest effort, and how much of it is not him not necessarily knowing where he needs to be?
I think from what I saw anyway, it was more not necessarily knowing what he should be doing in a given situation than not being willing to. He has a pretty good motor. You can see that off the ball and in transition. He pushes himself, and on defense, when he knows what he's supposed to be doing, gives forth the effort. But he did end up in no man's land a lot. And I think that's mostly just him not necessarily understanding the scheme fully and where he's supposed to be on the weak side there, because he was guarding a lot of shooting guards that weren't really high usage players. So he was just stuck on the weak side away from the action a lot. And he didn't really make any impact on the play most of the time that I watched.
Trevor, what about his decision making? I mean, he's going to be a primary point of attack a lot in the NBA. What did you think about him as a decision maker?
I thought he was actually pretty good here. I think kind of filling off of this, when he's put in situations where he has to make a simple read or a simple decision, he does pretty well at that on the defensive end. Particularly in transition defense, I was pretty impressed with him. He did a really good job in the USC game, for example. There was one possession where Kevin Porter was coming down on transition, and he's obviously a very strong transition player. He cuts off the drive for Porter. Porter kicks it out to a three-point shooter from USC, and Garland immediately jumps out and contests that shot in transition. Was a really nice play from him on that end. I think that he's fine at this point as a decision maker on defense, and I think that he's also fine on offense as well. You know, he's very comfortable in the pick and roll for a college player, and I think that's one of the things that stuck with me watching his film, is that he just makes those simple reads that he gets presented so often because Shitu is such a dominant pick and roll finisher. I think that he really has a good feel for making plays out of that, even if he's not making a ton of the advanced reads that we saw like Trae Young make last year. I think the biggest issue I have with him as a decision maker comes in those isolation possessions where we're not really seeing him play in a way that is going to make the team's offense more efficient. There's a reason that we have so much film of him shooting step backs and going to his pull-up jumper in these short games, and it's because he doesn't always realize when the opportunity presents itself to take a guy off the dribble, get into the lane, and create either a driving kick opportunity or a chance to finish at the rim, or even draw a couple fouls. He's much more confident in his handle and its ability to go to that pull-up than he is in those other more easy outlets to be able to create good offense for the team as a whole. And I think that that's where he needs to make his next step in improvement, is can he go from that Dennis Smith Jr. type player that's really hunting his own scoring possessions first into this guy who can make these high level reads in the pick and roll every time down the floor and goes to step back when it's needed, but is more often finding that shooter in the corner or finding his roll man to be able to initiate that first level of offense.
Yeah, building on that a little bit, I noticed in his pick and roll game, there's a lot of east-west to his game. He likes to go side to side and set up for those jumpers like Trevor mentioned. When he does get downhill, I saw some nice passes to the corner, and he had a nice no-look pass to Shitu inside, but those were few and far between. So using his ability to create separation off the dribble, instead of using that to set up his jumper, but to create opportunities to go downhill more often, could open up a lot for him on that end, I think. There was one play in particular where he started to drift to the right to get the defender leaning that way, then split the pick and roll and threw a great no-look pass after driving right at the help defender. So I think there's potential there for him to develop into more of a team offense creator, but he's just not there yet. It will take some time for that to develop.
We just have a few minutes left. I want to touch on two other topics since we've got Trevor here. Trevor, let's go briefly into the Jontay Porter injury. Talk about his ACL. Talk about what his long-term impact is going to be on his game. Can you give us the minute 30 breakdown on Jontay?
Yeah, so Jonte had ACL tear and MCL tear, which does complicate his return a little bit, mainly because he had to wait a little bit to be able to get that surgery. He had his injury in middle of October. He had surgery, I believe, about 2 weeks ago. So there was a little bit of a delay, and that's because you have to wait for that MCL to heal. You have to make sure the rest of the knee is stable before you can go treat the stability problem that the ACL presents. You know, we've seen guys tear ACLs every year. It impacts guys in a variety of ways. There's some guys who never get that acceleration, never get that athleticism back. There's some guys that come back and are able to be reasonably productive, and a lot of that time that comes from a skill set that doesn't lean so heavily on that athleticism. The guy that I really look to be an analog for what Jonte Porter's recovery is going to look like is David West. David West tore his ACL in, I believe, his second to last season with the Hornets, and was able to kind of reinvent himself from this secondary playmaker at the 4 into, you know, the bulldog rebounder, tough defender guy that he was with the Pacers, Spurs, and Warriors. And I think a lot of that came from his just innate understanding of team defense and understanding of how to make those winning plays on the offensive end to be able to contribute to that overall team offense. That sounds exactly like what Jonte Porter is going to be able to be good at the NBA level. That's what we all love about him, is his decision-making, his kind of raw, at this point, passing ability, and that ability to potentially create shots off the dribble, along with his team defense. I think that he's going to have a much easier time coming back from this injury than maybe a guy who had a little bit more athleticism would, because athleticism was already going to be a problem with him, and a lot of people in draft Twitter already had him as a potential lottery pick. So I don't really see this being a huge detriment to him, even if it does further cut down on what his peak athleticism is going to end up being, just because we're so reliant on the rest of his game anyway to be what makes him a viable NBA player. I don't think it's going to end up making that big of a difference. I think the one thing that is going to be interesting is seeing where he is in the recovery path when he comes back for the NBA Combine, because is he able to go through a lot of those drills to be able to demonstrate that he has that decision-making, that he has all of these skills, and maybe even has that baseline of athleticism that we already had that was admittedly low, but is a bar that he should be able to clear if he's going to be able to survive on an NBA floor. So we'll definitely see what that looks like. I think that's going to go a long way, not just in showing where he's going to end up going in the draft, but also if he comes out of the draft next year or this year. Maybe it's a situation where if he's not ready, he just comes back and plays his junior season because he seems to like being in college, and then goes into the 2020 draft, which would be very weird and very interesting.
I think there are a lot of questions about Jonte. I think his family history plays no small part in his injury and his recovery time, and how teams are willing to take a risk on him. I think there are a lot of questions just surrounding him. But while we got you here, there's one more thing on the agenda that we definitely want to talk about. And you and Connor are our point men on this one. I'll let you guys kind of take over the discussion. We've listed a couple of names here for our international class. And Connor, you want to start us off and talk a few international guys while we've got Trevor with us tonight?
Yeah, that sounds good. So I think the first person we had scheduled for was Sekou Doumbouya. Doumbouya is probably hands down the number one prospect in this international class as of right now. Really young for his age, might be the youngest one in the class, hasn't even turned 18 yet. Just a guy that really screams potential, especially on the defensive end. He still has a lot of IQ questions, but his defensive weak side rim rotations have stood out a lot this year. He's still a far ways where he needs to be on the offensive end of the floor. I think at least shot still goes out of every single camera angle.
He's so bad. It's so bad.
I think we're starting to see now him sort of shooting off movement a little bit, just a little tiny bit, which is something that we're going to hope to see in the future, I think. But I think a lot of his game is predicated on the defensive end of the floor and what he can potentially bring, and also his offensive skills of just being his size at 6'9" with such a good frame, and being able to handle the ball in transition and have such a good fluidity in that area of his game. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts specifically about his offense, and if you feel like you're starting to get to the point where his defense needs to start being a lot more production over potential.
Yeah, I'm not really worried about the defensive side of the ball. I mean, one of the things that's enticing about him is he has this nice frame and he has all these skills, and he still doesn't look physically mature yet. I think that his body still has a little bit of filling out to do, and I think that's what's really exciting about him, is that he can put on a lot more muscle. I think offensively, what really excites me is he shows these flashes of slashing ability and ability to make passing reads out of these cuts to the rim that we just don't see from college level players. And I think that is what's going to end up being a very good role for him. I mean, even if he never becomes that type of shooter, as long as he's a good defensive player, he can be kind of that Andre Roberson type, where he's kind of this cutter off ball, is able to get to the rim in transition, is able to make these simple little reads that are able to just keep the offense flowing and keep him from being such a negative by being kind of that record scratch guy where he gets the ball on the perimeter, is supposed to shoot, and just doesn't have the confidence to be able to. So I think that there's still hope for him on offense, and that's why I've got him still in my lottery at this point. But yeah, the defense is definitely where we're looking with him. He has potential to be a rim protecting 4, which is a pretty valuable role.
Okay. Next question. Is Luka Samanic still a first rounder for you?
I have him at the top of my second round. I took him out of my first round mainly because in the film I've seen from him, he just doesn't seem to really have an offensive role this year for his team over in Slovenia. Every time I see him, he is just kind of taking these weird post-ups where he can't get leverage against professional centers, and he's not really getting good passing reads, and just isn't really making smart plays on the offensive end. What I do like, though, is I like his defense. I think that he's still going to be a potentially productive player or defensive player even at the NBA level, especially once he figures out kind of what he's supposed to be doing within a defensive system. He's still not all the way there yet, but he makes pretty good simple reads just like Garland. And I think that he's got a role, and as long as his shot comes around, I think that he's going to be able to survive as a stretch 4. What do you think about him? I don't really see a path to him maybe coming out this year. I would maybe say that he needs one more year with a bigger load of responsibility to kind of fill that burden of proof. But where do you see him as he fits into this class?
Yeah, right now I'm probably comfortable where you're at here, sort of like very top of second round, maybe very back of first round. I think that I still see a strong chance that he could be a guy that comes out this year, just knowing how deep the next year's 2020 draft class is going to be. Other than that, I think that you're 100% correct. He's kind of sort of still floating in no man's land on offense. I haven't really watched a lot of him with Olympia this year, but I have what I've seen from him from FIBA over the last summer was him just really not knowing his identity on the offensive end of the floor. I don't know, partially team context or what, but because we saw the same thing with a lot of other big men that I liked. But I think defensively, you're right. I think he has a lot of the tools to be a good defender, and he does make he does make rim rotations, which I think is going to be something that he's going to have to do as 4 in a weak side rim protection, because I don't think he's really strong enough to add a lot of at least yet to add a lot of rebounding value as a 5. He doesn't seem like he does have a very strong frame either. Like what we talked about with Doumbouya, like him adding more muscle onto his body. I feel like Samanic is going to be a guy where it's going to be hard for him to add a lot more muscle on his body. I think he still, to me, I don't think I think the possibility of him being really switchable is getting further and further out of the question, where we see him sort of being a really good athlete, but not really having any kind of technique or ability to sort of react on ball to quicker guards. And then, so the last guy that we were going to talk about is Davidas Servidis. So I'll just start it off here, where I haven't seen Servidis outside of FIBA last summer, U18 European Championships. I actually really liked Servidis. I felt really strongly in the performance that I watched him, where I felt like he could comfortably be my second best player in the class after seeing Samanic sort of struggle in the beginning of this season and during FIBA. I think that he has great positional size for a wing. He's really smart off the ball, and I love off-ball guys with great positional size like he does, that can really shoot off movement and be able to read and react off movement, especially to their defenders. I think he has a little bit of value as a low-usage passer as well. Defensively, I'm not too concerned with him on ball, where I think you can sort of find places for him to be hidden. Not that he's going to be a horrible on ball defender, but he's not going to really stand out in that area at any level where he's going to guard a really high level player. His team defense off ball, I thought, was pretty good. I don't think it's nearly, I feel like some people kind of oversell it as like excellent. I'm not quite there yet. I probably want to see it on a larger sample size, but I think it appears he's at least doing what he can do right now in limited minutes, and he's averaged like 30 points in 2 like low level Slovenian league games this year. Mm-hmm. And so I think that he's definitely has a strong path as a role player. What do you think about him?
Yeah, I think it's very promising that every time he gets off of his senior club and goes to the junior level playing against kids his age, he just blitzes everybody. I think that he's a guy who kind of reminds me a lot of Sergei Karasev coming out, and Karasev obviously didn't pan out in the NBA, but I think a lot of that had to do with the mental aspect of the game and kind of his team fit in Cleveland. I think that you look at Servidis and you have a guy who's a great off-movement shooter. You have a guy who's good coming downhill, going towards the rim, and he at least tries on defense. And that's really all you can ask for with these younger European guys, especially if they're at some of the lower level clubs that are more focused on getting that offensive performance out of them. I think that his potential as kind of this bench scoring wing, kind of like we've seen come out of Europe in the past. Zanan Musa last year, good example, kind of along the same lines of what he's going to end up becoming, is kind of where I see Servidis. And in this class, is that worth a first round pick? Honestly, by the end of the year, it probably will be. As long as he continues to perform well at the senior level and continues to put up these high production numbers, and especially if he can put a little bit of mass on between now and the draft, I think he's going to look very attractive to somebody who's looking to get a little bit of pop off their bench, particularly among some of these mid-level playoff teams.
All right, guys. I kind of felt lost in all that. It's really nice to hear two dudes really engage on the international class. Trevor, we appreciate you coming on and talking about it with us. And obviously, this is something we're going to have to go back and do a little bit longer form on. I mean, we had a lot of stuff on Garland tonight, but we really appreciate you coming on and taking the time to talk to us about it, because it was hell. I feel like I learned a lot just sitting here listening. So. Trevor, before we go, do you have anything you want to get a plug in for? Anything you're working on?
Well, I've been focused a lot on Keldon Johnson the last couple of days, so he's going to be the guy that I'm doing my next scouting report on, and going to have a new big board out this week with my one-man tier 1 with Zion at the top. So look for that by the end of the week.
All right, man. We can find all your draft stuff on the Step Back. You also write for Fear of the Sword, so make sure you're checking out both of those and giving Trevor a follow at Illegal Screens on Twitter. He really does some good stuff. Trevor, thanks for coming on, man.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, no problem. Josh, Earl, the man, the myth, the legend. Josh, are you working on anything big over the next couple of weeks? I mean, obviously, you working with contextual scouting, doing a lot of things there. I know you guys are starting up another round after the holidays. Am I correct on that?
Yeah, so the next 8-week session starts January 7th. So a nice little buffer between the holidays and then kicking it off again at the start of the next year.
Give us a little plug on what contextual scouting is, who you want to kind of look into this program. Who do you think can benefit from it?
Yeah, so over the past 8+ years, I've been helping people get their first step into the basketball industry. Currently, I'm doing that with my business, Contextual Scouting. It offers an 8-week online course where you get 8 weeks of access to Synergy Sports technology, and you also get to kind of learn how to use tools like scouting, like stats, like video to solve basketball problems, because anybody that's hiring in any industry is looking for people who help them solve problems. And it's kind of through the viewpoint of the video department, because it's the best place to get your foot in the door if you're a mere mortal like us. And yeah, not a whole lot of people related to owners need to go through the video room, but the rest of us kind of do. And it's a great online 8-week program. You can get to build a portfolio of work that shows a team that you can help them, as opposed to just a resume that says you should be able to.
That's awesome. So, make sure you're looking into that, hitting up Josh on Twitter. You can follow him at 2RedJEarl. You can follow it on is it Contextual Scouting? I guess I should have done that.
Yeah, Contextual Scouting.
You can follow Contextual Scouting on Twitter at Contextual Scouting. So look into that if you're interested. It's a very good program. We've had some connections talking with people who've worked the program. They have the utmost respect for Josh and everything he does. Obviously, we do too, but we just like to hear affirmation that he knows what the hell he's talking about from other people. Connor Harr, what is up, my man? What do you got cooking for us this week?
All right. I will like to officially announce my DNP for next week's podcast via finals week.
Yep.
Other than that, I wrote an article about a week or two back on just my first opinions on Bol Bol and Charles Bassey. You can go ahead and look at that at the 94 feet. Other than that, after I finish my finals, I'm coming hard strong with a whole week of nothing but me locked in my room watching NBA, taking every single scouting takeaway I can take away.
I can't wait, man. I'm excited for you to shift gears a little bit. I'm also excited to just see what you come up with on this class. I can't wait to dig more into that. And last but not least, the executive producer, Mr. Eustacchio Raulli. What do you got cooking for us this week?
Look for my draft thoughts column to come out on Friday. And right now, though, really the focus is doing prep work for our draft guide this year for Red Team Scouting. We've got a lot of big things in the works. They'll make an appearance probably in about a month or so. So be on the lookout. But right now we're doing the legwork to make sure that the first release of our draft guide is great.
Awesome. You can follow Eustacchio on Twitter at EVR1022. I am Alex West. I write things, I say things, talk about things. I was on the morning shoot around on Monday. Talked about the draft class, broke that down. If you want to listen to that, it's not as topical, so you can actually go back and listen to it on the Monday edition, which was 12/3. I'm probably writing about something. I don't know. I'd try not to plan too much. I just like to go into the moment, sit down at the computer and type. So we'll see. You can follow me on Twitter at AlexWestNBA. You can follow all of us on Twitter at Red Team Scouting. When these announcements start to roll out, when we start to have dates, when we start to have people to announce who are going to be joining the team, when we do all these things, we're going to be sharing it with you. And we can't wait to work towards that first release of the draft guide, because that's something we really all enjoy doing, sort of a passion project. So anyway, for the Red Team Draft Podcast, we will see you next week, and we always appreciate you listening. So see you next time.